Welcome to Transforming Work with Sophie Wade, exploring the future of work. Find out what's going on, disruptions, evolutions, opportunities, challenges, and interventions in our multi-generational distributed organizations. With a new tech and talent focus, discover what you need to know to stay upskilled and relevant and ensure your business keeps its competitive edge. Sophie investigates the promise and reality of the future of work now and as we look ahead. She interviews people who are changing work experiences and practices and shares how we can each transition smoothly and successfully to effective and more productive new ways of working.
Hi. This episode is about co-creating our AI-infused future. The personal and communal agency we have individually and collectively, which it behooves us to engage. This is a period to be intentional and involved. Firstly, so your world doesn't change around you, without considering your contributed data and desires. Secondly, to be researching and experimenting with chats and apps, considering AI's dimensions, testing its strengths and weaknesses, its impact and influence, such as on trust, transparency, and values. This is the time for serious play. Thirdly, so diverse perspectives are debated, increasing initial friction to reduce asymmetries and improve capabilities and relevance. We are each and all best taking responsibility and intentionally co-creating with AI. I'm delighted to be talking with Juliette Powell, founder and managing partner of Kleiner Powell International, a consultancy working at the intersection of responsible technology and business. Juliette is on the faculty at NYU. Her research has focused on responsible deployment of AI, ethical data exploration, and the search for and removal of negative biases. Juliette also co-authored the new book, The AI Dilemma: 7 Principles for Responsible Technology. Hi, Juliette. How are you?
I'm feeling great. How are you today?
I am very well, thank you. Always starting at the beginning, you started with finance, international business, economics. Why?
Probably because I grew up poor, and the idea of being able to use knowledge to change that fact, not just for me, but for my mom, was really, really important for me. I remember, when I was a kid playing Monopoly, it was my favorite game, right? It was just this idea that you could change your circumstances. And of course, there was a whole lot of luck involved, but there was also skill. And so I think, from a very, very early age, I always wanted to be the banker. I wanted to better understand how things in the world work together, that interconnectedness, and why was it that some people had more than others? And, it's taken me a lifetime, and I don't know that I necessarily can answer all those questions as well as I'd like, but it's an ongoing set of questions for me.
So now, having done finance and international business, you then go into being a show creator and developer and host. How did that happen?
Actually, that happened at the same time.
Oh, okay.
So I was at McGill University while I was at Musique Plus, a tiny television station in Montreal, Canada. And I was on purpose studying in English while I was on TV in French and trying to keep that balance. And so most of the projects that I was doing at McGill was on the business of television. How could I get, the shows that I was imagining to actually get on the air? Well, if I could create a business case, then all of a sudden everybody was ahead of the game. It was a win-win. I could do well at school. I could get this show done. And, I could see my dreams evolve on multiple levels. So I've always been somebody who looked at it from a systemic perspective.
Growing the finance and business news over the course of being a show creator, producer, and host, it looks like you interviewed Tim Burton, Mandela, Beyonce. Obviously, Mandela, just off the charts. Of all these interviews, Mandela or any of them were the most impactful and insightful for you.
Absolutely Mandela. But I interviewed Mandela and Janet Jackson within a 12-hour period. Ooh. And I think that juxtaposition really gave me a lot of food for thought, not just at the moment, because everything's happening so quickly. And I was doing live television. So in one case, it was during, an awards event. on one television channel in Toronto. And then in the other, it was in the context of busing in 40,000 children into an Olympic-sized stadium for Nelson Mandela, where there would be, two prime ministers and a bunch of, VIPs, et cetera, et cetera. So very, very different contexts. And I think that in one case, I saw a woman, Janet Jackson, who was struggling. She was at the top of her game musically at that time. It's been that long ago. And at the same time, she had a full hour with me, the fans. We were playing her music videos. We were diving deep, just like you, really starting from her beginnings and where she was at and where she aspired to go. And in between, when we'd cut to commercial, she would worry about the way that she looked, how she was coming across. She insisted on having pillows put under her so that she was taller, even though in the wide shots we could tell that her feet weren't quite touching the floor. I mean, she suffered from so much insecurity. And on the other end, a few hours later, I'm on stage interviewing Nelson Mandela, who blew me away by his sheer confidence. And I didn't just mean confidence in terms of the show that we were doing there live, but rather the confidence to survive 27 years in prison and come out, in his own words, a better person for it, because he was able to find freedom in his own mind, irrespective of what anybody else thought. Again, just such a strong juxtaposition with Janet Jackson, who had also suffered a great deal in her own life, but they just dealt with it in such different ways. I learned so much about the kind of person that I wanted to be, and that you could make that decision. And I very much felt like Nelson Mandela, in many ways, was a mentor to me.
I can understand that from just an interview. There were nuggets you take away that just sit, and they're there. You then wrote a book, 33 Million People in the Room. What was the genesis of that idea and vision?
While I was working in television in Canada, I was also helping to produce a little-known conference by the name of TED, with its original founder, Richard Saul Wurman. And Richard was incredibly generous in terms of just introducing me to an incredible array of thinkers and doers, makers, creators, visionaries in many ways, who have, really built many of the institutions that we now, rely so heavily on, especially when it comes to technology and entertainment and design in many ways. So at one point, it became very clear that I wasn't just meant to work in television, that I was getting bored. To tell you the truth, I had grown up in television and I had seen the influence that it had, but it wasn't always a positive influence. And at the same time, I had been coding, working, on the back end, creating algorithms and better understanding data around our audiences. And I was alpha and beta testing, phones at the same time. So the understanding of what was happening in the front and in the back, when it came to entertainment, was fascinating to me. But far more interesting to me was the groundswell of people that were the real story, to me at least. And how, again, I grew up in Canada where, a lot of people that were on TV were literally discovered on the street. And hey, would you like to be on TV? And you had those incredible opportunities when you have, a much smaller population in a very different time. In the US, it's a very different calculus. And ultimately, what I discovered was that people on the ground were the story, and that it wasn't about getting, big television to come film it. It was about citizen journalism. And that groundswell was really catapulted through digital technology in the form of, yes, the internet, but also the rise of social media. And to me, those voices were far more interesting than the background that I came from, where everything had to be scripted or at least produced. There was also, after that, the rise of reality TV that I really wasn't interested in, but social media was able to capture, the voices of so many different people on so many different issues. but there were power structures involved. And I was also very curious about that in many cases, I was seeing social media being used strictly for entertainment purposes. And the mindset of the people that I saw was all about that entertainment value or wasting time, as they were told in school or at work when they were using it.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it was about building relationships, building resources, building
Right.
companies, building political campaigns. And so I happened to document the rise of somebody who became, president in the United States, Obama. And I was lucky enough to, and I'm so not a political person. I certainly
Mm-hmm.
had not followed politics at all up until that point, with the exception of looking at how they were using the technology and how they were able to align what they were trying to achieve with their messaging. And that strong combination of finding the right tone for the right message for the right audience and being able to target it on an ongoing basis,
Right.
and how you could amplify that and get people to move into
Mm-hmm.
action outside of the virtual world was even more fascinating. So I discovered the social graph, and I discovered, the importance of our personal data and how algorithms were really ruling the world. But that came over, a 20-year period of self-investigation as much as, investigation through work. And like you, I'm very lucky to get paid for, learning. I'm a lifetime learner.
It's very interesting to me when it comes to understanding the demographics and connections within each of these segmented communities. I imagine as you're understanding the relationship economy and the social networking for business, this is obviously how social media started off in the social personal space, then started to integrate into our working lives. How did you see some of those demographic groups and audiences evolve and the relationships within them and across them?
So I've always been of the perspective that I'm a whole person. There are many
Mm-hmm.
different parts to my whole person, but
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless, I try to think of myself holistically, so that when I'm running a company, I'm the same person that is, playing with my dog or taking a long walk or enjoying, some form of entertainment. I am the same person. I don't always put the same kinds of weights on my decisions as, I would in these different circumstances, but nonetheless, I've noticed that there's certainly traditionally a huge disconnect between the person that goes to work and the person that goes to school and the person that hangs out with their family, or
Mm-hmm.
even the person that, that is with their children, as opposed to the person that is with their parents, right?
Yeah.
You kind
Yeah.
of divide yourself in many, many cases. When you're driving a corporation, the decisions that you make are to the benefit of the corporation. And if you're a public company, that's part of your mandate, which, in some cases, I've also noticed the distinctions between what engineers, for example, have to go through when they're making AI decisions in their engineering
Mm-hmm.
work, where their morals aren't necessarily aligned with the work that they have to do to be able to earn a living, and how do you navigate those imbalances. And so all of these things to me indicate a way of being, and to me being in touch with all of those different parts of myself as I navigate the world is
Yeah.
really important to me. And I think that I tried to articulate some of that in that first book, certainly imperfectly, but by highlighting some of the people that I knew that really lived those truths, lived that holistic approach, whether it was Jimmy Wales, the
Mm-hmm.
founder of Wikipedia, or John Perry
Mm-hmm.
Barlow, the founder or one of the co-founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who had also written 90% of the songs of the Grateful Dead. So very, very different
Right.
modalities, but fully integrated people. And I think that today, post-pandemic, we are really starting to see that integration become much more mainstream, as again we try to struggle between, in your case, in your specific interest of the work, the future of work, that hybrid between the office and working from home or working from wherever the heck you really want, has become a central issue. I remember going on my very first vacation when I was really, really young and seeing this incredible couple. They were on the beach in Thailand, and one was Japanese, the other one was American, and one was a coder doing translation software from English to Japanese, the other one from Japanese to English. They were getting paid in Japanese yen. They were living in Thailand on the beach and, living like kings, because obviously the currency exchange it's much more in the favor for the Japanese yen. So literally living like kings. And yet they were literally living the life that they had always wanted. And I remember thinking, I want that freedom one day. What do I have to do to be able to set up my life so that I could work from anywhere in the world on the things that I really care about? And here we are in this world. And so I feel very, very privileged. I'm talking about the entrepreneur that starts his own company, and from that very, very specific perspective.
During that period where you were seeing this disconnect for many people in terms of the work that they were doing, that there has been an evolution towards a stakeholder economy, towards a different way of thinking about business. I believe that part of that has expanded the focus for younger people on the creator economy and focusing on an area of work and entrepreneurship that they can have more control over. Starting with that thread, that relationship economy, do you see that building further over time, staying more separate from the more traditional types of business? Or do you see these relationships becoming more integrated again?
I think it really depends what industries we're talking about and what the motivation is for people to find work. So I think of my students at NYU, for example. I think for the most part, they are coming from different places in the world. And for them, the number one thing is they want to maintain their visa once they graduate. So they need a job.
Right.
And to be able to live in New York City, you need a really good paying job, a job that, that's going to make it so that even if you've got 4 roommates, you can still eat. And that's not necessarily an easy thing because thanks to the pandemic, prices have gone through the roof, as I'm sure you've read about. So I think that when you're in that position, no matter whether it was before the pandemic or now, the pressure on you to go find that type of job make you do things that you probably wouldn't necessarily consider doing otherwise. And now we get back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? When you're really looking at surviving as opposed to your social life, as opposed to self-actualization at the top, you ask very different questions and you make very, very different decisions. So I'm not trying to skirt your question, but I do feel like there are major nuances in the way that I would answer. I don't feel that there's a huge generalization that I can make. When it comes to the traditional route, I think that many of us got a chance to see that there were alternative routes and that we didn't necessarily have to follow in the footsteps of our parents or our grandparents in terms of, finding a good job and staying with that job for a very long period of time before looking at other options. I think I grew up with this amazing thing called the internet, where all of a sudden my mentors and my possibilities went beyond my own geography. And I could see different business models and different ways of operating. Entrepreneurship was not a big thing when I was growing up in Montreal at all. There was Cirque du Soleil and Cirque du Soleil, right? This idea of entrepreneurship did not come from the environment in which I grew up. It came from reading other people's stories online from different places and, reading different news stories and different, people that inspired me. I didn't meet Nelson Mandela because I grew up in South Africa, So in other words, going back to that model, I still grew up with the internet. We still had a lot of resources that our parents and our grandparents did not have. Now, does that make us the first round of creators? Maybe in a way, but ultimately, when I look at the ecosystem now and the pressures that I'm seeing on young people, I think that a lot of it also has to do with mental health. A lot of it has to do with, again, looking at what does it take for me to survive? So much of us are
Sure.
focused, oh, what does it take for them or us to thrive? But what does it take for so many of us to survive? I think that needs to be addressed before we can even go into the other stuff.
The way that working for a corporation, but having a side hustle, one for financial stability in order to be able to make rent, however many roommates you have, and then also to be developing that idea that what's going to keep me sane, because working for the corporation that doesn't care about me, that can reject me at a moment's notice, is part of that mental health balance. It's a financial need and it's a mental support.
Yeah. And for me, it's always about having a plan A, B, C, and D. To me,
Right.
that's how you navigate uncertainty. It's like it's doing a risk benefit analysis in a very clear headed way, which is one of the things that we teach our students in our
Oh,
responsible media and
great.
technology class. It's how do you make important decisions that are both on the personal front as well as on the business front? And I know that that's a topic that you've addressed with several of
Yep.
your guests, and with good reason. There are
Mm-hmm.
many ways to do it, but so few of us are actually doing it. And I think that because we rely so heavily on our digital devices and our algorithms to guide us, we do it less and less, and we activate those functions less and less.
Then the Gathering think tank, what was the core of that you felt that there was such a need to create that? What were you trying to generate?
So I had learned from some of the people that I mentioned earlier that the previous generations had all of these incredible ideals. And
Mm-hmm.
once they got into power, those ideals were replaced in some ways or moved to the
Mm-hmm.
side in some ways with
Sidelined, yeah. Mm-hmm.
other principles. And I, since learned how, when you get hired in a large organization, for example, where you start is not where you end up, right? And at every level, every time you get promoted, you get socialized and re-socialized and re-socialized to better fit that particular role and that particular level within the organization. And I think that
Interesting, yeah.
that's what happens to us in life as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every turning point socializes us and makes us aware of new things and new ways to look at
Right.
things. So, anyways, ultimately, I think that all of that learning has made a huge difference in the way that I kind of look at technology and look at its impact on all of us as well. Something that I wasn't necessarily aware of. I'd say the first 15 years of my working in technology. It's only when I went back to
Mm-hmm.
school that I kind of took the time to look at that. But I think that to answer your question, the gathering was something that derived out of the TED conference itself. Four of
Sure.
us were helping to create the conference with Richard Saul Wurman, and we're wondering where the heck people under the age of 40 were. Why was there not more diversity of everything? Diversity of race, but also
Yeah.
diversity of culture, diversity of thinking, diversity of education.
Yeah.
And of course, it's changed a great deal since then. But ultimately, that was the seed. And then the goal, more to the point, was to make sure that we didn't make those same mistakes, that we didn't
Okay.
forget why we started doing something in the first place, as we'd seen with previous generations. And so we had people like Astro Teller, who is now in charge of X, not X, former Twitter, but X, which is the Moonshot Factory
Mm-hmm.
at Google Alphabet, for example. And several of the people that work at that Moonshot Factory are, co-founders of the gathering along with me. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that was one of the key elements. It wasn't just me or the four initial people that shaped the gathering. It was each and every one of us, just as at the TED conference. The expectation, or at least in the beginning, was always that whoever's on stage is also part of the audience, that there was no separation between the expertise on stage and the expertise in the audience. And I've always taken that very, very much to heart. There is expertise in the everyday person. There is expertise,
For
that
sure.
we don't
Yep.
necessarily reward financially or recognize, that that tacit knowledge is invaluable. And so, again, just to maybe abridge the story and get to the answer to your question, I wanted to make sure that the technologies that we were putting out into the world and the ideas that we were putting out into the world weren't forgotten in terms of why we started doing them in the first place, why we were first passionate about them in the first place. What were we initially trying to accomplish with them?
Right.
Yeah. And so again, fast forward, when I think of, all of these people and what everybody's been doing in the last 20 years, it's really, really interesting to see from that perspective how much people have evolved.
And from there, you started really focusing on AI and mapping big data, looking at to see what it could do, what it could bring us, what the future trajectories might be. You started Turing AI and wethedata.org. What were the key things that you were trying to achieve, and how did that evolve over time?
I was asked to be a mentor for the TED conference. My mentee, Eric Berlow, was approached by Intel Labs to map the personal data ecosystem. And at the time, Intel had spent millions of dollars trying to do this over the past 5 years and wanted to see if we would come up with a different answer. And of course, we weren't necessarily intending on interviewing all of the Intel lab engineers because that didn't make sense to us. So we went to the world. And in my mind, of course, coming from my background, the easiest way to get to the world was through TED, because we had a very small budget, a fraction of what Intel had dedicated itself to this. And with that budget, we built a tool that would allow us to map, but we needed the data, we needed the input, we needed the tacit knowledge from data scientists all over the world. And as a result, because we couldn't fly everywhere, and honestly, people didn't want to just use the tool impersonally, we checked to see if they would be available to come to the TED conference, and they were already coming, so it was perfect. Over 48 hours, I put together 100 different data scientists, for-profit, nonprofit, weren't just representative G8 countries, truly representative of the world. And we were able to collect enough data to figure out that there were 4 grand challenges if we wanted data, personal data, to work for everyone on the planet and not just the usual suspects, the people that hold and control the data. And they were very straightforward, intuitive grand challenges, but we actually had the science to back it up. And so, digital trust is kind of key. And you've mentioned that a great deal in your show in the past, but also digital infrastructure. As basic as that, we think that, everybody has the internet, everybody has, that's not true. In fact, the majority don't. And so that infrastructure, even if you have it, do you have access to that infrastructure? Or is it just, read-only access? Can you actually write? Can you actually, participate in the creation and the diffusion of knowledge deriving from that data, and so on and so forth? And so all of these things kind of came into play. And then Turing AI was very much kind of the corporate side of things, where we started a movement with wethedata.org, which ended up at the World Economic Forum, and MIT Technology did some wonderful work around that, kind of showcasing it, and met some wonderful people like Sandy Pentland at MIT, and just brilliant people working in the space. But at the time, all we were doing were theorizing about what could we do if we owned our own personal data, because the research showed that if we did, that would change everything, right? It would change the power structures. If I had the power to say to the large corporations, sure, you can monetize my data, but you need to give me a cut, right? And at the time, Groupon was really, really big, and that was becoming this larger movement, this idea that people could potentially aggregate their personal data to be able to have more power in face of these large organizations. So we ended up creating a personal data eBay for data, if you will. And we're able to do some really great work in Finland. And anyway, all of that happened from 2012 to 2017. And then I found out that my mom was dying of cancer. We found out that she was in her fourth stage. And so she was like, well, what happened to the first three? Not sure, Mom, but we're going to make the most of what we had. So from that point, my life completely changed. I stopped consulting, took care of my mom, and when she finally passed away, went back to school to see what kind of impact all of these technologies were having on the planet. And I can tell you that I came away wide-eyed, and at the same time, I'm so glad I did, because that's how I ended up doing my dissertation on, the limits and possibilities of self-regulation in artificial intelligence, which then became the seeds of the book that, was released a few months ago called The AI Dilemma.
First of all, I'm so sorry about your mom. That must have been very, very hard. And I'd like to go back to that time before that. There's such a difference between how people in the US feel ownership of their own data versus Europe in particular, with GDPR, obviously, which came much later. But there is more sense here now that that data is actually mine. That has triggered some more recognition of where the data sits and what is being gathered and what can be done with it and who owns it. Do you have any sense, having been so deep into this ownership of data, why there isn't more of a sense in the US, which is so much about the individual? Why doesn't that encompass my own data too?
For the most part, while I was doing research while I was at Columbia University, because I asked that same question, I wasn't sure what the answer would be. So I decided to not just ask the question in the United States, but also ask the question in Finland, and got very, very different answers to your point. In the United States, it was much more about, oh, well, only poor people do that. What, like, only poor people would care about getting paid for their data. And this
Wow.
was me trying to imitate a very young person, but ultimately, the
Wow.
response I got in Finland was, "Oh, this is so wonderful. But I already own my data. I am part of this. I'm part of S Group. S Group owns everything. And because I'm a member, I de facto have a bank account with S Group. And when they make a profit, I make a profit and I see the dollars and cents going into my bank account every year. And as a result, I'm also fine with the fact that that data, my personal data, and that of everyone I know, and those of my parents and my grandparents and my children, is
Right.
also being monetized and used by the government to make decisions about our well-being, right? Don't forget that Finland's also considered the happiest country in the world over,
Yes.
this has been happening for many, many years. It's also got the highest rate of
Right.
suicide, but again, they have a very different definition of happiness.
And also, they're very close to the North Pole. So that's just like light matters.
It does.
Very interesting that that was the response in this country.
Yeah. And so when I asked them, so how much do you think your data is worth? Like, if a company was going to ask you and want to pay you, how much would you want? And in Finland, they were very, very clear. We want at minimum what we have to pay, right, to get our streaming services or to get our additional file sharing services, or
Okay.
whatever it is that they had to pay on an annual level was the minimum of what they felt that they should be getting. In the
Right.
United States, well, I have no idea. In the United States, it was, and of course, there was a difference between people that had a lot of money, people that had less money, and people that had no money. People that had no money, they're like, oh yeah, bring it on. But what do I do with it? And how do I do
Right.
this? And so you'd have to do these huge trainings, a
Right.
lot of learning involved, and you'd have to put systems and processes, and you would need a personal data exchange. So we've seen over the last few years lots of data exchanges which are B2B. We have yet to really see a B2C,
Yeah.
or a C2B, even more powerful.
Yes. Yes. How are your students absorbing and reacting? Because at the very beginning of a career, there are so many possibilities and you aren't channeled into one. You aren't necessarily feeling that things are going to change so much because you are at the beginning of all the changes and all the possibilities in your life versus somebody like millennials who may react differently. How are you finding people are reacting excited about, concerned about all the different elements that you are thinking about, talking about, and educating your students about, not just technology broadly, but including very specifically AI?
The majority of my students would consider themselves falling into three camps.
Okay.
They consider themselves either artists, creative technologists, or entrepreneurs. And there are much, much fewer entrepreneurs than I would suspect. I think for the artists and the creative technologists, they're generally terrified. They're terrified that by the time they finish their degree, none of the skills that they've developed over time will matter.
When you say artists, just to clarify, you mean in terms of whether they're digital artists or painting artists?
Yes, yes. I'm talking the gamut from fine arts to digital
Right.
arts
Okay.
to the performing arts,
Right.
all of them. And it's can AI do and will it do
My job.
what I do better than I can, faster than I can, cheaper than I can? Will what I bring as a human be valued? And this is not, over the course of my career. This is by the time I graduate. This is by next semester, next year, 2 years, 3 years max.
Yeah. Right.
Right?
Right.
So this uncertainty that came from the pandemic is just exacerbated when it comes to meaning. And that's what I'm hearing under it all is, will I still matter? Will I have meaning? Can I contribute anything?
Do I actually have a role in this world? Wow. And the entrepreneurs, they're excited?
The entrepreneurs are excited. Like, what can I do with
Right.
generative AI?
Right.
Let me ask generative AI what I can do with generative AI.
Yeah. Exactly. They're on that. What are you then sharing? Comforting, reassuring? There's little true reassurance right now. How are you giving them some grounding and mental as well as creative tools to be thinking about the future?
First off, I'm teaching them how to do their own research. I'm teaching them the scientific method. I'm introducing them to the NYU librarian. Oh my goodness, a real person. It's not just a bot. In fact, I bring her into class so that she's an actual human. And she's really nice. And she's one of many, of course. But that grounding in research methods, I think is something that I learned at Columbia, and something that, most corporations who are developing AI or deploying AI for monetization purposes is not an approach that they're necessarily taking. But taking that perspective helps remove some of the fear, because now you're doing an experiment. And we can do that because the technology is new enough in the hands of the everyday person that there are no real experts. You can try to tout yourself as an expert. There are no real experts. So the reality is that they can then do these pieces of research as an undergrad or as a grad student or as a postgrad that they can publish. Right? They can do double split experiments. They can do things where they can track what their expectations are before they actually do the experiment. They can do things where they're learning as they're doing and they're teaching. So for me, that's the best method of all. I learned by example. I learned by, watching somebody like Mandela do extraordinary things. And now I get to see how my students learn how to do extraordinary things by teaching themselves and by teaching others. And to me, that idea of publishing while you're still at school is not something that ever occurred to me the first time I went to school. But now, those are the seeds that are going to allow you to grow no matter where the technology grows.
Right.
right? That
Right.
ability to question from a rational perspective and to learn through others, because that's it. They all present to each other. And one of them is really looking at the role of the creative director and creative designer in film. And to your point, it's one thing to have an idea, like to generate a draft of something, and the other to actually get the systems to create the thing that you're trying to create when you need to create it,
Mm-hmm.
right? In a timely
Yeah.
fashion. How many people do you have to hire to get that done? And can the technology actually even get you there? Right.
Not yet.
There's so many questions. And so she's done this amazing research that answers exactly your question. So here we've got a 20-year-old who's going to be able to educate you and educate the world as she educated herself, thus removing some of the fear and giving her confidence that no matter what happens in the world, she can move through it, because now she's an experimentalist. Now she's a researcher.
What an awesome teacher you are.
Well, I get to be the chief experimentalist in my own life here.
I can imagine that dealing with these students, interacting, teaching, and hearing their concerns, their joys, their excitement with the underlying concerns that you had before and from your study of AI that generated this book. There are 7 principles in terms of the systems, in terms of the underlying aspects of how the AI is created and how it's implemented. Of those 7 principles, are there any that are more important?
To me, creative friction is something that we tend to avoid. It is something that
Mm,
we think is a problem, right? We don't want to have hurdles to be able to get to the thing that we want to get to, especially when
yeah,
we want to get to it now. And
right.
of course, our devices allow us to make a whole lot of those shortcuts. If we want to buy something on Amazon, there's a buy button. It's really, really handy, right? If we want
Yeah.
directions to somewhere because we want to get there fast, or we get to figure out what our route is by pressing a few buttons, and boom, there we're there. The car shows up. Thank you very much. We don't have to touch anything, especially with the pandemic. All of that
Mm,
touchless service is
yeah.
something that is just going on the rise. And there are many reasons for that, but it also isolates us in many different ways. And as a result, we rely more and
Hmm.
more on our devices because they're closer to us than actual humans in many cases, even though now we have more choice than we did a few years ago around that. And
Right.
so I just find it absolutely fascinating to just see these divides happening, wholly predictable, absolutely wholly
Hmm.
predictable. And I think that's part of the other issue is that, again, depending on where you are in your life, if you're just at that survival level, you don't have time to be thinking about all this stuff. But
Hmm.
if you are in a place where you can, rise above the sand for a moment and take a breath of fresh air, things have changed a lot. Things have changed a lot probably within yourself, even from the last
Mm.
time that you looked. And so asking yourself the question, who you are now, might be very different. And that idea of creative friction means that you're also allowing others to ask themselves who they are now and what matters now and in the future. And the more questions you can ask of yourself, the more likely you're able to ask questions of our technologies. And so, this idea of creative friction within the
Oh.
organization is incredibly powerful. Um, David Stark, one of the professors that I studied under at Columbia University, went to Wall Street and essentially found that the most diverse teams on Wall Street are the ones that earn the most. And yet, it's the teams that take the longest to deliberate. Why? Because they ask questions not just from the perspective of, their obvious office face or their trader face.
Hmm.
They're also asking as a whole being of where they come from, of, their culture and their background and what they care about, their religion, all of it, right? They're asking the
Hmm.
questions, the what about questions
Right.
that many of us, when we surround ourselves with people that think the same way of us, don't think to ask. So that creative
Mm.
friction can only come from deep diversity. And if you think that it's just a Wall Street thing, of course it's not. There have been many, many,
Right.
many studies, but Professor Stark also went to Tokyo, found exactly the same thing at the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And again, when you look at the
Mm.
Tokyo Stock Exchange, if you're not Japanese, you might think, oh, they all look the same. No, they all have very,
Hmm.
very, very different backgrounds. And so the more
Sure.
diverse, the more they produce questions The longer it takes to
Mm.
deliberate, but the better the outcomes. And I think that if we take longer to deliberate around our AI systems in their specific use cases and contexts and bring in the various communities that will be affected by the technologies themselves before we start building them, as we design
Hmm.
them, and then as we deploy them, constantly incorporating that feedback, we'd have much better systems that would work for far more people. And again, that scientific method incorporated within that is really important.
Not only is there bias to do with the algorithm, to do with anybody's perspective or the people who are designing something. We've heard that over and over and over again. And then with AI, it's learning from these enormously widespread and deep sources. The bias is so deeply baked in without being identifiable with these principles. When you're looking at the systems and the approach, how do we really deeply try and address these issues of bias or influence?
Well, sadly, bias is part of our human nature. It is
Mm.
not something that I can imagine any technology, any drug, any maybe some sort of meditation. If you're really good at it, I imagine that monks are less biased than the rest of us, but maybe not. I don't know. I feel
Right.
like it's part of our human nature, just as I discovered through the research for the book that this need for control is actually biological within our human species, because it's allowed
Okay.
us to survive, right?
Right.
And ultimately, that's what we're here for. We're all about our own survival above everyone else's. And I wonder to what extent that doesn't fall into that same category.
Yeah, it may do.
And as a result, any system that we create is going to have a form of bias.
Right. So how do we mitigate or manage it, I guess? Manage the elements of bias. I'm British. I go with the word fair, but what does fair mean?
Right. And again, the question, fair for whom? Just as we talk about
Yeah.
ethical
Yes.
technology, ethical for whom? There's
Yeah.
always, and
Yeah.
you know this in sociology, right? There will always be a 1 or 2% at the top, and then you've got 98 to 99% that will be below that. And even if
Right.
the people at the bottom become the people at the top and vice versa, there's still a top and a bottom,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that bell curve, that distribution doesn't go away.
No. No.
I think perhaps what we're thinking of is that historically, we've always seen the same groups end up at the bottom. And so when
Yeah.
we talk about AI, we also talk about power and how much there's an asymmetry of power between people that are creating and controlling the technologies,
Hmm.
monetizing on them, and
Hmm.
to many extents, creating a surveillance system, not just for companies, but for the world, right?
Right.
And those of us who don't even you know, anything about algorithms, don't know anything about data, don't know anything about the kind of influence that it can wreak on society. Because think about this, the majority of people on the planet don't have access to the kind of infrastructure that would allow them to even get a sense of what we're talking about right now. And yet, potentially, some of these countries are having elections this year that might influence the balance of power for democracy. And much
Right.
of it will be influenced by these invisible algorithms that the majority have no sense of.
Right.
Ultimately, I think that why anybody should care about any of this is because I think if we all woke up a little bit more to the kind of power that we give away,
Mm.
then we could also realize the kind of power that we actually have if we decide to do something about it. I live a few blocks away from Columbia University in New York City, which has been the hotbed of a lot of political protest in the last few
Hmm.
weeks. And I'm
Sure.
seeing the determination, the sheer determination of students, and also determination coming from Columbia University, and they're going in opposite directions. But nonetheless, those are shows of power. And
Yeah.
I think until we actually see people rise up in the world and say, hey, that's our data, and hey, you can't just monetize it without allowing me some element of control, then these asymmetries will continue.
For sure. What are you most excited about with regard to AI?
That I get to be born at exactly this moment in time in history, and that we are the generations that get to shape it. I'm not so sure that that will necessarily be the case, for future generations. That whole access to the infrastructure, that digital literacy, the ability to write and not just read, digital trust. Where the heck will digital trust be in the next 100 years? Right? It depends on what unfolds now.
The fact that we're going towards digital trust and who we trust, the trusted sources of truth, where are we going to go for our truth?
I think that just as you mentioned on a show very recently, you were talking about curation, right? How
Yes.
we don't necessarily need content creators as much as we need curators.
Yeah, Dr. Lekudpeski.
And I think that's absolutely the human model.
Yeah.
When we were, just agrarian or living in a village, right? We turned to our leaders, we turned to our priests, we turned to, our teachers, depending on the kind of community that you live in. But ultimately, these are curators of knowledge, curators of how the world works. And that curation piece, I don't think is more important than it was, but I do think that people are thinking about it a lot more than they used to. I think in the
Sure.
past, we'd think of our experts, and now being an expert isn't as highly praised as it used to be, right? There are a lot of people that are attacking different kinds of experts, whether it's political experts, economic experts, religious experts, all kinds of experts. But ultimately, that ability to not just become a stakeholder, but actually a stakeholder that has a voice is something that's been enabled by technologies.
The challenge is quite extraordinary for corporations thinking about exploring, experimenting in exciting ways for their employees, which is augmenting what they're doing, but also changing their jobs. With your understanding of social dynamics, the relationships, personal and professional, do you have any ideas or thoughts about people's roles within organizations, how those are going to be developing and evolving, and psychologically being able to manage them?
I think the only job that will not go out of style, thanks to technology, will be the psychologists. I think psychologists are needed. And that sense of well-being, that sense of, what is my meaning in this world if I'm not doing the kind of work that I thought I would be doing or think I have the talent to be doing, is going to be really, really key. But ultimately, that ability to navigate is an internal one as much as an external one. So we have to be able to manage all of this uncertainty on the individual level as a community, but also we need the tools and we need the infrastructure and we need the political will and the economic will to allow for
Right.
people to be able to make their own choices.
How do you advise an organization, let's just say senior executives at an organization, to be thinking how to be integrating technology in a way that makes sense for both the business and the people?
One of the key elements that I talk about in my book is the four logics framework, the four logics of power around artificial intelligence. You've got government logic, corporate logic, engineering logic, and social justice logic. Going back to that engineer that we talked about at the beginning of the interview,
Yeah.
that all of a sudden is confronted to having to build technology that goes against his or her moral sensibilities, is classic, and it's happening. It's been happening for the last few weeks. For example, the No Tech for Apartheid movement that we saw, a bunch of people getting fired at Google around the country and around the world because they don't like what they're having to build. And we've seen it before in the tech vault in 2018, where it wasn't just Google, it was multiple companies in big tech that got these government contracts to work on things that they weren't comfortable working on. That is not going to go away. And part of the issue is that we're seeing, big tech essentially supporting, well, they want to make money, right? And they're also vying to become the number one AI company in the world. They're all vying for that. They're all vying for AI supremacy in their own way. And to be caught within that web, that organizational web is not an easy one, which is another reason why I think that now is the time. If you feel that your personal morals are being confronted by what you're being asked to do at work, whatever it may be, now is the time to recognize that disalignment, B, check to see if your morals align with the overall messaging about what the company's about, what's the brand about. If those two things are not aligning with your sense of the way things should be, you need to leave. There will not be further alignment after that. And ultimately, I think we need to see more people moving to a place where they can be fulfilled, where they can work on things that they find meaningful using their own skills or using new skills that they potentially have learned. But to me, that alignment has to be okayed by the organization. I think that understanding that alignment needs to happen in HR as we're trying to find candidates, that alignment of culture and vision, not just capabilities and skill sets.
Yeah.
And these are questions that as we automate our HR systems are getting weeded out.
Yeah.
Right. Ironically, the negative biases that you were talking about earlier, I've had the opportunity to consult with a few large HI organizations that are just trying to figure out, how to navigate the AI sphere, just like the rest of us, and understanding that if you remove those human elements or you rely on AI to remove human biases, it will come up with other biases.
Yeah.
That it's all about the data that you're collecting. And to me, the most powerful data is real-time data, especially when employees, no matter where they are within the hierarchy of the organization, get a chance to weigh in. And to your larger question, how can we use AI within the organization? Ask your employees, how are they using it? Not just in the times when they're not supposed to be using it, but in the times when they are. How are they using it at home? How are they using it with their friends? What have they discovered? Set a challenge, a set of grand challenges within the organization. This can be an experiment, right? You guys can get together in informal teams across the organization, and whoever comes up with the best process that's going to help us, using generative AI, great, gets to lead that team. It might not be part of your job, but this is how we're discovering new leaders within the organization. And so these kinds of things include your people. And even if they're not in the office, but they're, in contact through digital technology, you can still do these kinds of things. How are you empowering them to teach the organization, become a learning organization?
A fantastic way to end. Thank you very, very much. I'm so sorry to be running so late. It's been such a fantastic conversation. We've gone so broad and so deep. Really, really appreciate it. Okay, take care. Thanks again so much to Juliette Powell, Managing Partner of Kleiner Powell International. You can follow Juliette on LinkedIn and on her website, juliettepowell.com, JuliettePowell, as well as finding out more about her company, KPI, and the new book, The AI Dilemma, 7 Principles for Responsible Technology, at theaidilemma.com, theaidilemma.com. Immediate action tip. Ask employees how they are using AI in their work and in their leisure time. Set AI-based organizational challenges to surface new leaders and empower them to teach others, and shift to become a learning organization. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend and like it. You can also consider writing a quick review wherever you listen. For regular video updates, curated useful articles, commentary, research, and information, follow me on LinkedIn and sign up for my Work in Progress newsletter there. Thanks for listening. Until next time.